Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we're discussing Game 57 of the regular season for the San Jose Sharks as they took on the Dallas Stars and lost by a score of 8-3. This is not the first time that the Sharks have been blown out this season, which is not something I'm particularly happy about saying, but it's also not really a surprise considering the Sharks currently find themselves dead last in the entire NHL. But the thing is that not every single one of these blowout losses are made the same. It's sort of a sliding scale. Some of them indeed are irredeemable. There's no bright spots, there's no good moments, and you're just kind of wanting to forget them and put them in the rearview mirror rather quickly. I think back to some of the blowout losses from the beginning of the year against the Vegas Golden Knights or the Winnipeg Jets, but others are nights in which the Sharks actually have a okay effort, not enough to win, but perhaps better than what the final score would indicate. I think a prime example of this is the game a couple of months ago when the Sharks would lose 8-1 to the Tampa Bay Lightning. On paper, that was the Sharks' worst loss of the entire season with a -7 goal differential, and yet at the time I said so. My hot take was that I didn't think the Sharks actually played all that terribly that night. Certainly deserved to lose to Tampa, just not by as lopsided a score as it ended up being. And I think here tonight against the Dallas Stars, this game falls into a very, very similar category. The thing is that 57 games into this season, with this already being a losing year, it is very easy to just take this game and say, oh, another terrible effort for the San Jose Sharks, as it has usually been the case this year. Let's move on from it and look forward to the Sharks draft position by the end of this year. But I think that kind of does a disservice to this team and what they're managing to do. This game is obviously not one in which I'm saying, oh, the Sharks were better than Dallas. Very far from the case. The Stars definitely deserved the victory just as they did, but that perhaps this 8-3 loss maybe not fully indicative of some brighter moments that the Sharks had here tonight. Considering the difference in the level of teams here, where the Sharks are dead last in the league and the Stars are a potential Stanley Cup contender, I think San Jose did an alright job of holding their own. Now, before getting into how this game fully played out, I do obviously want to mention the return of both Mikael Granlund and Cody Ceci here, having been just traded away from the Sharks last week. They returned to San Jose to play this game on the other side finally, and considering they have been on the Sharks side of many of these blowout losses, I'm sure they're kind of feeling for the Sharks teammate as they lose yet another game by such a lopsided score. So it is kind of interesting that they are quickly back here in San Jose. It's the same thing that happened back in December when the Sharks traded Mackenzie Blackwood, and then less than 2 weeks later the Sharks faced off against Blackwood with the Colorado Avalanche. Funny how that sometimes works out, but nice to see the two of them again, and hopefully they can go on a bit of a run with the Stars. Moving on to this game, it starts off in the first period, and the Sharks come out very much in it, I would say. Clearly felt as though they deserved the better outcome from that previous game against the Vancouver Canucks, so they want to carry that momentum and that energy into this one, and they caught the Stars by surprise to start off with this goal from William Eklund, who makes it 1-0, and then about a minute later, it is Fabian Zetterlund who makes it 2-0. But as we know, a 2-0 lead just 3 minutes into the game for this Sharks team, there's nothing safe here. This is not something that the Sharks are going to be able to realistically hold on to, and it is proven immediately as just about 15 seconds later Duchesne cuts the lead in half, and eventually Robertson ties this game up at 2, and that is the last that we will see of a San Jose Sharks lead this game. Marchment then makes it 3-2 Dallas, and that is the score at the end of the first period. This first period, I would say, was the Sharks' worst of the game. While it started off exceptionally well, at that point Dallas just took over and never really relinquished control here. They played the majority of the rest of that period in the offensive zone. San Jose could barely even manage a shot. It was pretty much all Dallas. The second period, however, I would actually say not only were the Sharks maybe even with Dallas, but perhaps better than them as well. It wouldn't look like that on paper. This is actually the only period the Sharks wouldn't manage a singular goal in, and the Stars would put up another 2, but the Sharks, I think, did a great job of playing in the Stars zone and getting their own chances. Most of the time when the Stars would get opportunities, and that did occur, it was mostly off the rush. And as we know, even 57 games into this season, the Sharks are still quite bad at defending against the rush, as we saw on this Maverick Bork goal that made it 5-2. So the Sharks do still get burned, but I think the effort level was there, and I can't be too disappointed with this middle frame, even if the goals kind of go against them. Matt Duchesne as well adds a power play one early, and it is 5-2 after 40 minutes. Now the third period is where things kind of get weird and get a little bit of way from the Sharks. It seemed as though the message going into from the second intermission into the third period from Ryan Warsofsky was like to empty out the tanks and that they're not out of this game and they need to play extremely aggressively, because that's indeed what the Sharks were trying to do. They played a very aggressive game in this third period, guys jumping up in the offensive zone, in the neutral zone, playing up, leaving guys uncovered there, and Dallas were able to take advantage of this quite fully. They had 3 more goals in that third period. One would be dropped back by Walker Duehr, so it ends up being a 3-goal game for the Sharks, but indeed an 8-3 loss that, again, I feel as though maybe doesn't fully do justice the relatively decent effort the Sharks did have here tonight. I don't think this was one of the worst games of the season for San Jose. Clearly not the best, but maybe more so of like a bottom 30% thus far. Moving on to the players to talk about, we have the Sharks' top line of Eklund, Celebrini, and Toffoli. And as I mentioned earlier, the really, really bad blowout losses, there are no redeeming factors. There really aren't many players that you're actually trying to highlight in a good way. But here tonight, there absolutely were, because this top line for the San Jose Sharks actually looking very, very solid. Celebrini, Eklund, Toffoli as a trio were the best line for the Sharks by far here tonight, and were pretty much outmatching any opponents that they were on the ice against from a Dallas perspective. And I'll start off with Macklin Celebrini, because we saw the other night against the Vancouver Canucks, Celebrini actually played a pretty decent game. Defensively, he was rather solid. Offensively, there was a lack of execution, but I don't think you can be too disappointed with him. However, what we did see is that on the 2 goals that the Vancouver Canucks did score, the first of which Celebrini is just barely stepping out of the penalty box after his delay of game penalty, and then the second, he gets called for a pretty phantom hooking call that somehow ends up being a penalty shot, so this is a really bad call from the officiating team, but I imagine Celebrini at the same time will bear some responsibility for the fact that the Sharks lost that game. He will internalize that and likely blame himself, so he probably wants to come out on top of this one really with a ton of energy, and that's exactly what happens here. He picks up the primary assist on this William Eklund goal. He probably could have had at least another point or 2. He came oh so close multiple times. I felt as though he was a very positive impact player for the San Jose Sharks here tonight, certainly one of their best players on the ice. And what I really liked about that is that he does this against a really strong Dallas Stars team. Sure, kind of like the other night against Vancouver, where the Canucks didn't have Quinn Hughes. The Stars tonight did not have their best defenseman, Miro Heiskanen, but the thing is that Heiskanen is not the kind of gear that turns this Dallas Stars team. They are a very, very deep squad that even without their number 1 guy, they can still boast a really, really good team. So the fact that Celebrini was able to find the openings that he was, I think is a great sign for his development moving forward. Were there some mistakes here, some small nitpick moments from Celebrini? Perhaps, but again, the driving force for the Sharks offensively, I think his line did some really great things, and he was a big reason for why. When it comes to his 2 wingers, we do have William Eklund, who manages to score here tonight. Absolutely love to see that, and I think generally that William Eklund had a really strong game here as well, but it also goes back to what I mentioned in that previous review against Vancouver, which is it seems as though Eklund is like 80% of the way there. Once more, we saw him get 2 glorious opportunities back at the beginning of the second period on the same exact shift, where he has essentially a one-on-one with the goaltender and ends up missing it both times. We see him multiple other moments in this game where he gets a great chance right in front of the net on a great setup from like a Celebrini or from a Tyler Toffoli, and he just kind of fans on it. He did score the 1 goal in a similar situation like that, but like on the power play he misses it. At even strength he's missing it. So with a bit more finesse, a bit more poise in William Eklund's game, I feel as though like an explosion of points could be coming, and he is still rather young at just 22 years of age. He gets a little bit stronger and maybe that kind of clicks and suddenly Eklund becomes a 70 to 80 point player. It's just right now he's on that borderline and you're hoping that he can manage to cross it. And then when it comes to Tyler Toffoli, also rather impressed with Toffoli's game here tonight. He looked rather engaged. We saw him use his body, use his physicality to try and make some plays, get some turnovers, and I thought that worked actually rather well. He played just a solid, even strength game with both Celebrini and Eklund. He didn't quite get the usual kind of in front of the net high danger chances that you expect from him over and over again in some of the previous ones, but I still think he did a pretty good job. As I mentioned, best line of the night for the Sharks by a decent margin. But I will say the Sharks' second line was semi-competitive in that they actually had some pretty solid shifts, and that is, of course, Zetterlund, Smith, and Podorowski. Actually, no changes, by the way, to the entire lineup from last game against Vancouver to tonight. And we'll start off with Podorowski here because it's not a surprise to see him in the lineup yet again. Once he played on Thursday, it was quite known he wouldn't head back down to the Barracuda to then play back-to-back games Thursday, Friday, Saturday, so he was going to get yet another look. The good news for Podorowski, this was likely his best outing with the San Jose Sharks. His two previous games, not so great, but here tonight at the very least he picks up an assist and does some decent things. The bad news, on the other hand, I don't think that there's quite enough here to really keep a spot on the lineup moving forward. Right now, the Sharks are still quite shorthanded with many different injuries, but once the Four Nations Face-Off tournament ends and we're back in action in a couple of weeks' time, it is likely that Sturm is healthy. It is likely that Wenberg is healthy. Kostin was already a game-time decision, so multiple players will be stepping out of the lineup, and it feels as though Podorowski will end up being one of them. It's just, at this point, I don't quite believe he has the high enough skill, the high enough pace in his game to really be able to compete at the NHL level. In a way, he reminds me as maybe like a higher effort Will Smith back at the beginning of the season, and at that time I had said Will Smith probably should have been playing in the AHL, but the difference being is that Smith, there was a vested interest in him having success because he's a 19-year-old who is hopefully factoring in for the future of the San Jose Sharks. Podorowski is 31 years old. There's not really some huge investment being made into this player to try and have him have success in the future. So if he's not playing well for the Sharks right now, and these last three games haven't necessarily been that great, there isn't much of a kind of very real reason to try and keep him around on the team. And if later down the line, when a guy like Sturm probably gets traded, maybe a Luke Cunnin gets traded, and more openings do arrive on this main squad, I feel as though there are other players with the San Jose Barracuda, younger players as well, who will deserve an opportunity to come up and show. So I'm not entirely sure if we will see Podorowski again with the Sharks this season. When it comes to his two line mates, Will Smith and Fabian Zetterlund, I actually thought both of these players had rather solid games, created some plays. We'll start off with Fabian Zetterlund, who I think actually defensively did some pretty good things here tonight. Not usually someone who's well regarded for his defensive game. He doesn't play much on the penalty kill. He actually doesn't play at all on the penalty kill. He's not someone who the Sharks are sending on in a tense 5-on-5 situation defending a 1-goal lead, but I think he was actually rather solid in this particular area. When it comes to Will Smith, he made he set up some really good plays, as he usually does. We actually saw what ends up happening here multiple times in this game, especially in the second period, is that the Sharks would have a first line shift with Eklund, Celebrini, and Toffoli. Toffoli would end up going off for a change. Smith would replace him and then get like a brief opportunity, 10-15 seconds on the ice with Celebrini and Eklund. And when this occurred, it actually ended up looking really, really good, where there were some close calls. So it's interesting to see that happen. I don't think that necessarily means any sort of big lineup changes are coming in the future, because again, Eklund, Celebrini, and Toffoli have been really solid together, but it just goes to show that now that Smith has really found his game as of late, he could be a very interesting option with Macklin Celebrini if Warsofsky does so choose to go in such a direction at some point. But generally, again, Smith, I thought, had a pretty good game. What I really liked from Smith was back at the beginning of this game, where he actually gets into kind of a below the goal line puck battle with one of the Stars defensemen who is 6'7", a big guy, not someone who's really easy to knock off the puck. And I thought Will Smith, who is usually going to lose these puck battles, as we have seen earlier on this season, did a pretty good job of actually holding his own. It's just a singular puck battle. You're not reading so heavily into it, but again, it shows the progress that he has made, which is really all that matters for this player. What is unfortunate, I will say, about Will Smith is that this break coming up kind of comes at a bad time for him. Every single other player, or most other players, I should say, on this roster will appreciate the amount of time off that they're getting. But for Will Smith, who has been on this role, who has been playing his best hockey of his entire career, which is kind of just the best hockey of this entire season since this is his first year in the NHL, you kind of wanted to see him really carry that forward and just keep going with a game after game after game. With 2 weeks off, it's unpredictable how he's going to return from the break. Hopefully he can still resume where he left off. We'll see what happens. When it comes to the Sharks' third line, it is again Cunnin, Goudreau, and Colin Graff. This third line has actually been rather decent for the Sharks in these last couple of games. Here tonight, though, it is a departure from that. This third line is not good. They did have like 2 or 3 solid shifts in the third period, but the fact is that the first 45-50 minutes of this game, not nearly as solid. When it comes to Colin Graff, he was great against Montreal. He was great against Vancouver. Here tonight, a much tougher team, much tougher opponent than the Dallas Stars. There's not as much room to work with. There's not as many of those offensive opportunities you're going to get. He had one close call call, as I mentioned, in that third period. But besides that, couldn't really make that same Colin Graf impact that he has been in previous games this week. When it comes to both Cunnin and Goodrow, they were also not really all that good at all, besides those couple of shifts in the third period. As per usual, this is not really not much of a surprise for Goodrow. What we have learned throughout this entire season is that on a fourth line role, Goodrow is like semi-serviceable, but once he inserts himself into the top nine, which is something that has currently happened because the Sharks are as shorthanded as they are, it is immediately just like a downturn in terms of play. Goodrow is not good enough to be in a top nine. Very evident here tonight. It wasn't a terrible game from him. He's just not a very positive impact player. And then when it comes to Luke Cunnin, maybe even slightly more disappointing just because Cunnin did show some flashes of decent play in the earlier parts of the season, but it feels as though right now he has settled back into being more of that like third to fourth line player, but definitely not a third line center. He struggled here in that area going up against such a deep Dallas team. When it comes to the Sharks' fourth line, we have Grundstrom, Dellandrea, and Dewar. Now, they were quite good against the Vancouver Canucks, and as we know, Warsofsky loves his fourth lines, and so for him being quite good, that actually means like absolutely legendary amazing, and so they are given the time of day here in this game, and they reward Warsofsky with some pretty bad play. They were on the ice for three of the four even strength goals that the Stars would score in the first two periods of this game. And it's one thing if you're on for 3 goals on your like 20 shifts. It's an entirely different thing when you're a fourth line and you don't really get a lot of ice time in the first place. So you're on for like 3 goals against in just 6 or 7 shifts that you had, like 8 minutes of ice time. That means like every other time you're stepping on the ice, you're giving up a goal. And while it's not entirely their fault each time, all 3 of these players individually, when this does happen, it's kind of an indication that, again, against such a deep team like the Dallas Stars, a fourth line of Grundstrom, Dellandrea, and Dewar is just not going to cut it. They do manage to score here, they bring it back, and it's a very nice pass from Ty Dellandrea, the type of play you expect from like a Will Smith or a Macklin Celebrini, certainly not from a Ty Dellandrea, but it works out, and so that's decent. But as I have mentioned time and time again, the role of a fourth line is to make sure that when they're on the ice, the other team isn't scoring, that you're pushing the pace enough that the other team isn't really getting the looks that they do, and so getting outscored 1-3 at even strength, that's too high event for a fourth line and way too negative as well. When it comes to the Sharks defensively, we have the top pairing of Thrun and Jake Wallman. So this is actually the only swap we see in this game. Wallman moves to the right side, Thrun moves to the left side. Not entirely sure why this is the case. We have pretty much never, if I'm not mistaken, seen Wallman play the right side this season. Thrun has at least done it a few times when he has been paired with like Vlasic or Mukhamadullin in previous parts of this season. So not entirely sure the idea behind this, but I guess in a way you could say it doesn't work out because this first period for Thrun and Wallman was quite disastrous. Both of these guys making tons and tons of mistakes. And what ends up happening, interestingly enough, is that Thrun gets benched for the final half or so of that first period. Now, I don't disagree with benching someone on this pairing, but I actually would have trended towards doing so with Jake Wallman because the thing about Thrun here tonight is I think there were absolutely mistakes, but many of them are sort of like an execution variety where it's not so much like bad habits creeping into his game, it's just that he's not exactly doing what he knows he needs to do. But when it comes to Jake Wallman, as has been the case for much of this last month really, is that there are these bad habits that are creeping into his game and that are really affecting the team and himself very negatively. Moments where he is just way too aggressively puck watching in his own zone. He's not paying attention to where the other team is on the ice. We see this on the Jason Robertson goal, where instead of actually playing the man, he tries to play the puck, sort of an Erik Karlsson style of way of defending, which just does not work out here. We also see the aggressive puck watching on the first goal that the Stars score, where Wallman is kind of skating around the zone as a bit of a headless chicken in a way, sort of aimless play instead of just keeping it much smarter and more secure and just slowing it down in his own zone. So I really didn't like what I saw from Wallman in this first period, and again, I thought he would be the one who would get benched if you had to make this type of choice, but whatever, either of them, I don't think it really matters considering both obviously had some major mistakes. They did bring it back, honestly, as this game wore on. Their second and third periods weren't as terrible, but the very kind of really, really bad first period for them for sure. When it comes to the Sharks' second defensive pairing, we have Ferraro and Thompson. Thompson was kind of the odd man out the other night against the Vancouver Canucks, while pretty much every other defenseman actually looked rather good. I think Thompson struggled a little bit. He was a good bit better here tonight. Thompson played decently well against the Dallas Stars, not like a huge amount. He still wasn't great, but I thought he was okay. When it comes to his defensive partner, Mario Ferraro, we have seen Ferraro kind of bring his game back from the brink over these last month, maybe even over these last couple of months. Perhaps as his name has really come up in the trade rumors, that is a motivation to try and play better and better, as we see with both Granlund and Ceci. Them managing to escape the sinking ship of the San Jose Sharks puts them in a really good spot to compete for not just a playoff spot, which they have already pretty much secured, but a Stanley Cup by the end of the season. I'm sure Mario Ferraro would absolutely love to do this, considering he has never been in the playoffs in his career thus far. So given that opportunity, he wants to play as good as he can. Here tonight, though, not the best outing for Mario Ferraro. Probably not a great way to kind of send out to scouts right before this huge break and say, like, oh, against a really good team like Dallas, he's not going to be all that reliable. But I don't think it was a horrific night for Ferraro at the very least. And then when it comes to the Sharks' third defensive pairing, we have Liljegren and Mukhamadullin. Liljegren's an interesting player because I think more often than not he is relatively sound defensively, but when he makes a mistake, it usually looks rather bad. First of all, he takes a pretty dumb, silly penalty in the first period here. I know some people disagreed with this one. I'm not in that camp. I think that this is pretty clear-cut interference. He just can't really be doing this in this situation. Then he gets out-muscled here on the Mason Marchment goal, gets knocked down, which creates this opportunity for Dallas. And then we also see him just have that poor coverage on the rush on the Maverick Bourque goal as well that made it 5-2. So they're just these egregious errors that do begin to pile up at times for Liljegren, even if usually he is relatively solid. So not a great outing for him. And then when it comes to Shakir Mukhamadullin, the good news is that I actually thought he was at the very least better than Wallman or Ferraro or Thrun. The bad news is that he himself still wasn't all that great, not extremely noticeable on the ice, had some decent movements. It does show that he is a pretty good skater and he moves with the puck pretty well. It's just about getting smarter in his own zone for sure and cleaning up some of the rougher edges of his game. I think he's going to be able to continue to do so. And then when it comes finally to the Sharks goaltender Vitek Vanacek, he gets another look in net here after what was a decent enough outing, I guess, against the Vancouver Canucks. I didn't think Vanacek was great against Vancouver because he didn't really have to be. The Sharks did a good effort in front of him defensively, which is not something we have usually said, but it did happen. And so there was a good enough effort defensively where Vanacek just had to be okay. But the thing is that okay against a team like Dallas is not quite good enough. And a lot of these goals, I mean, first of all, 8 goals, never going to be good, but a lot of them were quite weak. Before I get into that, I should note, I don't know why Georgiev doesn't get the get the pipe here in between the pipes at some point in this game. I don't know why Vanacek was left in for all 8 of these goals. I feel as though after 4, at the very least after 5, a change probably should have been made unless Georgiev is actually sick or injured or something like that. I don't know why Vanacek is left to dry here, but still, most of these goals, however, I don't think were particularly great for him. Sure, the Johnston goal, he can't really have. The first Duchesne one, pretty unlucky bounce, but the Marchment goal should never really go in. The Maverick Bourque goal, that could have been a save. The Harley goal, the 7th one, could have been a save. The Jamie Benn one, this is off of a breakaway, but when you've already given up 7 goals, at a point you kind of have to make a save. He doesn't actually manage to do so ever here tonight, so not a good outing at all for Vitek Vanacek. It's quite clear at this point that the Sharks don't have a reliable goaltender. I mean, it was already clear before, but this helps reinforce it after Vanacek was maybe somewhat decent in the other game against Vancouver. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action in a couple weeks as we now have this Foreign Nations face-off break. The Sharks used to have one player participating in that. That was Mikael Granlund, but now he's with the Dallas Stars, meaning the Sharks have nobody who will be playing at this mid-season tournament. So every single one of the Sharks players will have the opportunity to recharge, to relax, and get ready for that final stretch of the season and hopefully come back better for it. Class dismissed.